When investigators pulled the body of Billy Stton from a burned-out car at the bottom of a drainage ditch outside of San Antonio, they expected to find evidence of a crime. What they did not expect, what nobody expected, was to find that the crime had recorded itself. Strapped to Billy's body inside a bag was a tape recorder, and the tape was still running. Everything that had happened in that car, every word spoken, every sound made in the final moments of Billy's life had been captured on that cassette. The killers had no idea it was there. They had walked away convinced that whatever they'd done, there were no witnesses. They were wrong. There was a witness. It just couldn't speak yet. This is the story of 3 cases where the Texas Rangers refused to let a crime disappear. 3 cases where technology, patience, and investigators who wouldn't let go pulled justice back from the edge of disappearing forever. These aren't famous names. They aren't cases you've seen turned into Netflix documentaries, but they are exactly the kind of cases that remind you what it looks like when law enforcement does the thing it's actually supposed to do. Find the truth, no matter how long it takes. We start in 1982, and we start with a tape recorder that changed everything. Billy Stton was 24 years old. He lived his life the way a lot of young men in San Antonio lived theirs, working, moving through a social world of people he thought he could trust. Lety Castro was 22. The details of who she was, what she cared about, who was waiting for her to come home. Those details belong to her family, and they carry that weight in ways we can't fully understand from the outside. What we know is that on the night they disappeared, they were together. And then they were gone. Their car was found at the bottom of a drainage ditch. It had been burned. The bodies inside had been burned with it. For most investigations, that's where the trail ends. Fire destroys evidence. Fire removes trace. Fire was chosen for exactly that reason by whoever left that car in that ditch. Except they missed the bag. They missed what was inside it. When Texas Ranger investigators recovered the tape and played it back, they heard the murders of Billy Stton and Lety Castro. 2 names, Paul Wolf and Glenn Henderson, would eventually be tied to what was on that recording. But the path from that ditch in 1982 to courtroom convictions was not short, and it was not easy. And the tape recorder that started it all is only the beginning of what this case reveals about how the Rangers work. If you want to follow this kind of deep investigative coverage, cases where the evidence is stranger than anything you'd write in fiction, make sure you're subscribed. I cover cases like these every week, and there are stories already in the pipeline that are harder to believe than what you're about to hear. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Now, back to that tape. The tape was the kind of evidence that a prosecutor can only dream about, and the kind of evidence that should have made the case straightforward. But criminal trials are rarely straightforward. Evidence has to be authenticated. Chain of custody has to be documented. Defense attorneys have to be given the opportunity to challenge everything, and they should be, because that's how the system is supposed to work. What that tape represented legally was simultaneously the strongest possible evidence and a target for every challenge the defense could mount. According to investigators and court records, the tape captured enough to establish what had happened and who was responsible. Paul Wolf and Glenn Henderson were ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. What exactly those sentences meant in terms of time served, what the full details of their trial looked like, what specific arguments the defense mounted against that recording, those questions were answered in a Texas courtroom. What the Rangers brought to that courtroom was a piece of evidence that the killers never knew existed. Here's what strikes me about this case every time I think about it. Whoever put Billy Stton's body in that car and set it on fire had a plan. They thought about what they were doing. They chose a drainage ditch. They chose fire. They chose a location that might delay discovery, might compromise evidence, might give them time and distance. And they missed a bag. That's not stupidity. That's the randomness of crime scenes. The Rangers didn't catch a break because Wolf and Henderson made some obvious mistake. They caught a break because a victim happened to have a recording device on his person that his killers didn't find. It could have gone differently. The bag could have burned. The tape could have melted. The recovery could have damaged it beyond use. None of those things happened. And two men spent the rest of their lives in prison because of a cassette tape at the bottom of a ditch. Think about the chain of decisions that had to hold for that evidence to actually reach a courtroom. The investigators at the scene had to locate the bag inside a burned vehicle containing burned remains in a drainage ditch. They had to understand immediately that what they had was fragile and irreplaceable. They had to document it, package it, transport it without damaging the tape further. A crime lab technician had to be able to extract audio from a cassette that had been through a vehicle fire. And this is the step that people don't always appreciate, someone had to listen to it and understand what they were hearing, and build a case around what the recording established, rather than just treating it as a single piece of evidence in isolation. Every one of those steps could have failed. Any one of those handoffs could have compromised the tape. The fact that it didn't is the result of professional discipline at every stage of the process, not just the lucky discovery of the bag itself. But Texas 1982 is only where we start. Because 6 years later, on the other side of the state, a 72-year-old woman named Lydia Schumacher was found dead in her home. And the case that followed would take 3 years, 2 failed polygraphs, and a technology that barely existed yet to reach any kind of resolution. Lydia Schumacher was 72 years old. That's the first thing to understand about her. Not as a statistic, but as a fact that reframes everything about what happened. A 72-year-old woman in her home in 1988. She had lived through decades of Texas history. She had a life that stretched back to a time most of us can only imagine. Whatever routines she kept, whatever connections she maintained with family and neighbors, and the rhythms of her days, all of it was interrupted by a violent act that should never have come anywhere near her. According to investigators, Lydia Schumacher was raped and murdered. The investigation quickly focused on a suspect named Charles Supak Jr. Investigators believed, based on the evidence available at the time, that Supak was responsible. But believing something and proving it in court are two entirely different things. And in 1988, the tools for proving it were limited in ways that seem almost unimaginable now. Supak took 2 polygraph examinations. He passed both. This is the moment in the case that I keep coming back to, because it illustrates something important about the gap between what investigators know and what they can prove. A polygraph is not evidence. It is not admissible in most criminal proceedings. It doesn't detect lies. It detects physiological stress responses which are shaped by any number of factors that have nothing to do with guilt. People who are guilty pass polygraphs. People who are innocent fail them. And yet in 1988, with the investigative tools available, 2 past polygraphs were enough to stall the case in a way that might have ended it permanently. Might have. But didn't. The technology that ultimately broke the Schumacher case open was called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. It's a method for amplifying and analyzing genetic material that in 1988 was so new it barely existed outside of laboratory settings. By 1992, investigators were able to apply PCR-based DNA testing to evidence from the Schumacher case. The results matched Charles Sykes Jr. 3 years. 3 years after Lydia Schumacher's murder, after a suspect had passed 2 polygraph tests and the case had appeared to be heading toward the cold case shelf, DNA said what the polygraphs couldn't. And here's where it gets more complicated. When confronted with the DNA results, according to court records, Sykes confessed. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. From a prosecution standpoint, the case eventually resolved exactly the way it should have. But the path there cuts through 3 years of Lydia Schumacher's family living without answers, 3 years of a perpetrator moving freely, 3 years of a case that the available evidence wasn't enough to close. If you're still watching and you want to stay connected to this kind of coverage, cases where the science caught what the investigators couldn't, where the justice was delayed but not denied, hit that subscribe button. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is this channel. The DNA technology used in the Schumacher case wasn't routine in 1992. It was still new enough to be genuinely remarkable. PCR had been developed in 1983 by biochemist Kary Mullis, and by the early 1990s, forensic labs were beginning to apply it in criminal cases. The technique allowed investigators to take very small samples of biological material, amounts that traditional RFLP DNA testing couldn't work with, and amplify them into something testable. What that meant for cases like Lydia Schumacher's murder was that evidence collected in 1988. Evidence that had been sitting in storage while investigators searched for a different path forward could be reanalyzed with a completely different methodology. And that reanalysis produced a result that changed everything. The theory, based on the DNA match and Sykes' subsequent confession, is as straightforward as these cases get. Charles Sykes Jr. committed this crime. The evidence proved it, and he eventually acknowledged it. What makes this case interesting for what it tells us about investigations broadly is the role that time played, not as an obstacle, but as an asset. The Rangers held on to the evidence. They didn't close the case. They were still running it when the technology arrived that could close it for them. That patience is a choice. Not every department makes it. Not every investigation gets that kind of sustained attention across multiple years and a fundamental shift in forensic capability. The Schumacher case got it, and Lydia Schumacher's family eventually got an answer because of it. But we're not done yet. Because 1994 brought a third case, and this one started with a body on the side of I-35. James Sykes was found on Interstate 35. That much the investigators knew immediately. What they didn't know immediately was who had put him there and why. A body on a highway suggests a range of possibilities. An accident, a roadside dispute, a planned killing made to look like something else. The first step in any investigation is establishing what kind of crime you're actually dealing with. The Rangers began working that question. The answer, when it came, was more complicated than anyone expected. Investigation led to a long-haul trucker named Terry Brown and his girlfriend, Tina Sampson. According to investigators and court records, Brown and Sampson were connected to James Sykes through a vehicle, specifically a truck that Sykes had either owned or had access to, which investigators believe Brown had stolen or taken by force. The theory, as developed through the investigation, was that Sykes was killed in connection with that vehicle. DNA evidence recovered from the truck matched James Sykes. That's the kind of physical connection that builds a case. A victim's biological material in a vehicle in a suspect's possession. a victim's body found roadside. But the investigation into Terry Brown didn't stop with James Sykes. Because as investigators dug deeper, they found something that reframed the entire case. According to court records, Terry Brown had also killed his own mother. I want to pause there for a moment because it's easy for a detail like that to land as just another piece of information in a narrative that's already full of disturbing information. But think about what it means for the investigation. You're looking at a suspect in one murder who is now connected to a second murder. A murder of a family member, which carries its own entirely different set of circumstances and investigative implications. The Rangers weren't just building a case against someone they suspected of killing a man on a highway. They were building a case against someone whose pattern of behavior extended to the people closest to him. Terry Brown was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Tina Sampson, according to court records, was convicted as well. Her role in the crime, as established at trial, was sufficient for a 20-year sentence. Whether that sentence reflects the full weight of what happened to James Sykes is a question that belongs to the people who knew him. Tina Sampson's case is worth a moment of separate attention because it illustrates something about how juries parse participation in violent crime. The prosecution's theory, as established at trial, was that Sampson was not merely a bystander. She was present, she was connected, and according to the evidence, she was involved. But the level of that involvement and the culpability that attached to it under Texas law produced a different result than what Brown received. 20 years versus life is a significant legal distinction. It reflects the difference between what prosecutors alleged Brown did and what they alleged Sampson did. Whether the families of James Sykes or Terry Brown's mother viewed that distinction the same way a jury did, that's something no one outside those families can answer. What the DNA evidence in the stolen truck established was a physical link that gave investigators the foundation they needed to build everything else on top of. In cases where the body is found roadside and the scene is the highway rather than a contained location, that kind of physical anchor to a specific vehicle, a specific person, is often the difference between a case that moves forward and a case that stalls immediately. The Rangers had the DNA gave them the vehicle gave them Terry Brown, and Terry Brown, under investigation, gave them a second murder that might otherwise never have surfaced. Now, I want to talk about what these three cases look like when you put them side by side, because I think there's something here that's worth examining carefully. The first theory that investigators always work in any homicide is that physical evidence at the scene or connected to the victim will tell the story. In the Stton and Castro case, that physical evidence was a tape recorder. Nobody planned for it to be evidence. It became evidence because it was there, and it survived. The theory isn't that investigators were particularly clever. It's that they were thorough enough to find what was there, and careful enough to recover it intact. The second theory that drives cold case investigations is that technology will eventually catch up to cases where the available science wasn't sufficient at the time of the crime. The Schumacher case is the clearest example of this. PCR DNA analysis didn't exist as a forensic tool when Lydia Schumacher was murdered. 3 years later it did, and it closed the case. Every cold case that's sitting in a storage room somewhere is potentially a future PCR case, or a future genealogical DNA case, or a future digital forensics case. The technology keeps moving forward. The evidence doesn't disappear. The third theory, and this is the one that I think gets underweighted when people talk about criminal investigations, is that behavioral patterns repeat. Terry Brown didn't kill James Sykes and then become a different person. He had already killed someone. The investigation into one crime opened a window into another. That's not unusual. It's actually fairly common in violent crime investigations, and it's one of the reasons that thorough background work on suspects consistently turns up more than the original investigation was looking for. What all three theories share is a commitment to keeping cases open until they're actually closed. Not closed administratively, not shelved because the immediate investigation didn't produce an arrest. Actually closed, with a conviction, with evidence, with accountability. And I want to be honest about something here because this is the kind of thing that gets glossed over in true crime coverage, and it shouldn't be. These three cases closed. They closed because the evidence held, because the technology arrived, because the Rangers stayed on it. But for every case on this list, there are cases that didn't close. There are cases with tape recorders that burned completely. There are cases where the DNA sample degraded before the technology existed to use it. There are cases where the investigation into one suspect revealed a second crime that still has no resolution. The Texas Rangers are good at what they do. They are not perfect. And the selection effect of the cases we know about, the ones with outcomes, the ones that produced convictions, means we are always hearing about the investigations that worked, not the ones that didn't. That doesn't diminish what the Rangers accomplished in these three cases. It just means that the full picture of what investigative persistence looks like includes the cases that never got there, the families who are still waiting, the evidence that's still in storage, the technology that hasn't arrived yet. And here's the most uncomfortable question in all three of these cases, and I want you to sit with it for a second before we go further. In the Stton and Castro case, how long between the crime and the convictions? What happened in that gap? Did Wolf and Henderson do anything else in the time between that ditch in 1982 and their eventual sentencing? We don't have a complete answer to that, and that gap matters. In the Schumacher case, Charles Supak Jr. passed 2 polygraph examinations. For 3 years, while investigators worked with what they had, Supak was free. The polygraph didn't clear him. Polygraphs don't work that way. But it created enough uncertainty that the case couldn't move forward on those results alone. 3 years is a long time for a family to wait for an answer. It's also a long time for someone who, according to the evidence, was responsible for a violent crime to remain free. In the Sykes case, the investigation into a roadside homicide revealed a second homicide that might otherwise have remained unresolved. 2 victims, 1 suspect, 1 investigation that almost started and ended with a body on I-35. These are the gaps that we don't talk about enough when we talk about what justice looks like. The gap between what happened and when it was proven. The time that passes while evidence sits, while technology catches up, while investigators are working other cases simultaneously. Justice in all 3 of these cases eventually came. But eventually is a word that belongs to the investigators and the prosecutors and the legal process. For the families, for whoever was waiting on the other side of these investigations, eventually felt like something else entirely. Where these cases stand today, Paul Wolf and Glenn Henderson are serving life sentences for the murders of Billy Stton and Lety Castro. Charles Supak Jr. is serving a life sentence for the rape and murder of Lydia Schumacher. Terry Brown is serving a life sentence for the murder of James Sykes. Tina Sampson served her sentence for her role in the crime. The Texas Rangers closed all 3 cases. The families of the victims have answers, even if answers don't fill the space that the losses left behind. The technology that solved the Schumacher case, PCR DNA, is now so routine that it barely registers as remarkable. There are currently thousands of cases in evidence storage rooms across this country that were investigated with the tools available at the time found to be unsolvable with those tools, and set aside. Some of those cases are going to be broken open by technologies that don't fully exist yet. Some of them are going to produce results in 5 years, or 10 years, or 20, the same way the Schumacher evidence produced results in 1992 that 1988 couldn't have given us. That's not a comfortable thought. It means there are people walking around right now who believe they've gotten away with something, who are wrong about that, who just don't know it yet. The tape recorder found with Billy Sutton's body. The DNA sample held in storage for 3 years while the technology caught up. The truck that connected Terry Brown to James Sykes. 3 pieces of evidence that changed everything. 3 cases where the Rangers decided that a crime not yet solved is not a crime to stop working. I want to hear your answer to this question, and I want you to leave it in the comments. Looking at these 3 cases, the tape that recorded itself, the DNA that arrived 3 years too late, the murder that revealed a second murder. Which of these cases do you think came closest to never being solved? And what does your answer tell you about what actually keeps investigations open when the easy path is to close them? I'm genuinely asking. The comments on this channel are better than most, and I want to read what you think. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. I post new cases regularly, and the next one is a situation where the investigators had everything. The physical evidence, the witness, the confession, and still spent a decade trying to prove what they already knew. It is stranger and darker than what we just covered, and I'm going to walk through every piece of it. The Texas Rangers have a phrase: one riot, one Ranger. It means that one person with the right tools and the right commitment is enough. 3 cases, a tape, a DNA match, a stolen truck, one agency that kept working until the cases were closed. That's what it actually looks like.